The focus here is going to be redlining and housing discrimination. You want to be able to define these terms by the end of this session and use the AP source framework sheet. We're also going to be looking at a couple. So here we have some of the required vocab terms. We've already addressed the Federal Housing Administration. We're going to be looking at the ability to pass on wealth and the role homes play in that ability. Redlining, we already addressed this particular map last class. This map right here, in conjunction with the FHA of 1938, is going to lead to increased segregation. And for any African American able to make it into the suburbs or into a white neighborhood is probably going to be subjected to some form of violence. Here we have some more terms. De facto versus de jure. De jure is segregation that happens by law, a segregation law. And de facto, I always take this section facto, and I like to argue that there's some other factor, and it could be economics, that is leading to the segregation. Housing, continue disparities between white and black Americans, as we also see limited access to some services like food, healthcare. Present day, they call these food deserts, as well as even access with regard to transportation, which is why small buses like the jitneys might be in some predominantly African American towns. For homework, you were required to complete the reading on the color of law, and this reading addresses a lot of the loopholes and strategies used to make sure that white and black remain separate. For example, in this section, it talks about promoting zoning ordinances to reserve middle-class family neighborhoods. How does that work? Let's say you have a town. You can zone this section of town, we'll call it Z1 and Z2. We'll even put in a Z3. Z3 can be a section of town that's reserved for industry. This could be reserved for stores. And then you also might want to take Z1, as it mentions here. They're reserving that for middle-class neighborhoods. Middle-class neighborhoods means that you're going to have a certain amount of income, and if African Americans cannot financially provide to live in that neighborhood, then that means they are not going to be included. Thus, the issue leading to segregation is economic. The reading addressed some other strategies that were used. In this scenario here, we're talking about a builder, and a builder is trying to build some homes, but the town is placing a restriction that says you cannot place black and white next to each other, and if you are, then you're going to have to construct some sort of wall, and that wall is going to be the dividing line. This might be an added cost that maybe the builder just decides it's not even in his best interest to go ahead with this particular proposal. Maybe he scraps the project or makes the homes primarily for one race as opposed to another. Another strategy the reading address is the use of restrictive covenants, and this right here is a restrictive covenant for a home association. And what that means is you have a collection of homeowners. Let's say we have 100 homes, 100 different families, and all of those homes fall under a homeowners association. Maybe that homeowners association takes care of some of the maintenance, for example, mowing of the lawn, snow removal, and so on. These individuals pay a certain fee for that service, and the housing association makes sure that the neighborhood pretty much is maintained correctly. Well, one of the restrictive covenant strategies here would simply be that you cannot sell your property to someone of a different race. So let's just say this guy right here wants to sell. If this restrictive covenant says he cannot sell to anybody other than his race, then that means this individual is not going to be able to sell. Violence would be another strategy. Here we see an image of somebody's property damaged. If you can successfully integrate into a white neighborhood, you will probably be met with violence. Here we have another example of some of the methods used. We're going to move on to some of the tasks and scenarios. Last class, we've watched the excerpt from the movie The Neighborhood from 1982, as well as an episode of All in the Family that addressed some of these housing issues. We're going to look at one of the required sources, and in this required source, it's looking at this desire in this source, the conversation between Ruth and Mama, whereas Mama is bringing up the rat trap, and the rat trap is a reference to where they live. We was going to set away little by little, don't you know, and buy a little place out in Morgan Park. So it's the desire to move out to Morgan Park. Currently, they are living in what they believe to be a rat trap. So what you want to take from this source here is this desire to leave where they fit. We're going to move on to some of these scenarios here. And we want to keep in mind that Brown versus Board of Ed ends segregation in the school system, but that doesn't mean that these groups here cannot play the segregation game by utilizing these strategies here. So let's look at some of the examples and scenarios that were outlined in the book. We're going to first start out with the FHA insured loans. These are loans that are backed by the federal government. And so when you're taking out a loan, let's say the home costs you $100,000, the bank charges you interest. The average is usually 30 years. And within those 30 years, you pay $100,000 in interest, bringing your total up to $200,000 cost per buyer. $100,000 for the home, and then $100,000 in interest. And let's just say at the end of 30 years, if your property is worth $300,000, then you are able to sell it for a profit. If sadly you pass away, you could then have this home transferred to your children or someone in your family, which is the whole point of inherited wealth. So the issue here is if a loan is not backed by the FHA, there's less of an incentive by a bank to want to issue a loan out because their concern is, are they going to get their money back? In other words, if the person defaults and doesn't pay, then that means the home goes back to the bank, which means now the bank owns it, which they always did anyway. You were just living in it and paying it. So the banks are relying on you, the home owner, to pay for the home as you live in it. One of the methods that increase segregation in the reading, charging more in interest. In this scenario here, the home cost $100,000, yet the individual, possibly viewed as a risk, is now going to be charged more money in interest. $200,000 in interest. In the prior slide, it was $100,000, bringing your total cost to $200,000, but now you are paying $300,000, and that is your cost, which means if they start to charge more interest based on one's race, then that means that people of color are going to be paying more for their homes. Another method is agreeing not to sell. Here we have 3 homes on this block selling for $120,000. That is their value. And there was always this fear that if an African American moved into a neighborhood, that was going to bring property values down, which is precisely what happened. The African American here is charged $160,000 because they probably in the 1960s, 1970s want to live in a suburban neighborhood, possibly if they want to deal with some of the white backlash. But the end result is people start to panic. Let's just say this individual wants to sell their home. Their people who are buying that home might want to know, well, who else lives here? And the minute they find out that an African American family lives here, they might be willing to pay less. So there's always this belief that moving African Americans into a white neighborhood is going to bring down property values. So what do? You just all collectively agree not to sell to somebody of the opposite race. This is not the federal government. This is not the local government. This is homeowners looking out for their wealth. Here we have an ad addressing that particular point. Look at these homes now. Save your home. Vote for segregation. Again, the belief that if someone black moves into this particular home, the property values on all of these will drop. Another method, zoning restrictions, which could take place by City Hall. Here we see a town. We have a developer here. And you have sections of town that are designated certain areas for zoning. For example, this could be heavy industry. This section is zoned for black. This section is zoned for white. Maybe you have a section here that's zoned for stores. So the method here, you could simply deny developers trying to build homes, or you could redirect developers, which gives them less of an incentive. If they're going to have to pay more for homes, for example, if it costs them $100,000 to make a home, yet they're being told by the zoning committee or City Hall, you have to put up a brick wall separating white from black, or you need to zone in this particular area here, which is reserved for black, that might bring your cost from 100,000 to maybe 120,000, which means you are paying more to make those homes. There's less of an incentive with all these constraints to provide for people of color, which means developers looking out for a profit incentive are going to go for the 100,000. Another method, charge higher for services. Here you have a home with the sewer line. And if you want to hook up into the city's sewer system, there might be a different fee. In the white area, let's just say the developer is being told, well, if you're going to provide for the white race, that means that it's going to cost you $100 to hook up all of these homes to the sewer line. However, if you are providing for black families, then that means that you are just going to be charged more, 150. Again, this brings up your costs as a developer, which means there's less of an incentive because there's less profit for you to develop homes for African Americans. Another method here, the FHA will not back loans unless you have a barrier. Now, this is a federal government policy here. And what's going on is, let's just say this is the white area. This is the black area where you plan to develop. Again, the fear is once black populations move in, property values are going to go down, which means white citizens are going to go to probably town meetings and complain that their property values are going down. One of the things here is this developer is being told that the loans will not be backed unless you have a barrier. So you have to put up a brick wall that separates the races, and that is what's going on here. This barrier is separating black from white, which means that any black potential home buyer, unless they have all of the money for the home, the FHA will not back their loan if they are living without this wall. So there's less of an incentive by the developer to develop certain areas simply because the cost maybe of that wall is going to cause problems as well as eat into profits. And again, this is all designed to increase segregation legally. Another example that we've already addressed is the homeowner association. As it tells you here, any portion thereof shall never be occupied, used, or resided on by any person not of the white race. So this is an example of a homeowners association denying rights through the process of restrictive covenants. The long-term impact. Now we're going to transition, and we want to think about here is the home. If you are buying a home, let's say in 1940, as it mentions here, as a white homeowner versus a black homeowner, you're in a position to buy a home easier if you're white in 1948. It's more difficult for you if you're black. By 2021, the homes have increased and can be sold, given to family members, which means the home you purchased for $8,000 in 1948, in 2021, maybe you could sell it for $350,000, whereas the black family possibly has less to leave to their family or sell upon death. This is the point of inherited wealth, which is why the numbers are so different. White inherited wealth by 89 in comparison to black, and definitely a discrepancy there. So we're going to look at a couple of scenarios. We want to recreate this sheet. We have the scenario and then the federal government or the local and state government. And what you want to do here is you want to figure out who do you complain to, who's responsible, the federal government or the local government. So here we have the Federal Housing Act. It's designed to reduce risk for banks, especially during the Depression, who are dealing with a series of defaults. What we're going to do is look at the scenario here. Again, you have to put yourself in the position of a banker. So as a banker, you're looking at the map here. You have these various zones, green, blue, yellow, red. In the green zone, 90% are likely to pay back their loan in comparison to 20%, which means the red area has a higher rate of default, which means that they're not going to pay back their loan. What do you do as a banker? The task for the prior scenario, you want to lobby to the government for solutions. The issue here is banks are not issuing loans because they're concerned about risk. What can you ask the federal government to do? What can you ask the local and state government to do? We're going to move on to scenario 2. A black family offers to buy your home at $9,000. Will you sell the home? Numbers indicate home selling prices. So all of these homes are selling for $6,000. This is in a segregated neighborhood, and the first black family that's trying to move into the suburbs is willing to pay you $9,000, which was the point of the All in the Family episode, The Blockbuster, where he was trying to get a black family into this area at first at a higher rate. So what's going to happen here is if these individuals start to panic because a black family has moved in, maybe they're willing to take less than $6,000. Eventually, you will possibly see the property values go down. What you want to think about here is black home buyers want to buy homes in the suburbs. What should the federal government and the local state governments do if they are concerned about declining property values by white homeowners? We're moving on to scenario 3. An offer to buy your home at $9,000. Will you sell? Notice home values. So we already have a black owned property here, but now another one is here, and this white family is willing to give you $3,000. And why are they willing to give you $3,000? Maybe they're concerned about this neighborhood being integrated. Again, the black family is paying $9,000, which means now you have one home and two homes that are moving towards integrating this area, which means all of these other potential homeowners are going to panic unless they're comfortable living in an integrated neighborhood, at which point it's really not going to matter. Want to lobby to the federal or the local government? White homeowners are concerned about declining home values. What do you do about this scenario? Scenario 4, protect your wealth with protective covenants. One of the things you can do with the protective covenant is you can have the homeowners association create this ruling, and this ruling is basically telling all of the homeowners you cannot sell to a member of the Negro race, which means the process of blockbusting and integrating is not going to happen. Everybody's home values are going to stay the same because no families of color are going to move into those areas. Keep in mind the protective covenant. This was designed by homeowners associations to try to prevent families from selling homes to members of the opposite race out of fear of declining home values. Once again, you want to lobby to the federal and the local state government. Scenario 5, government housing projects. As mayor, you need to resolve a housing shortage. Here you have your constraints here. You have the white section, and you have the black section, which is here. You have industry and these other areas for our town. So what I'm asking you to do is zone the town. You have a housing shortage, and we see the amount of people living in these areas. The black families in need of housing are 120,000, which means what do? Are you going to try to isolate all of the black population here, or are you going to try to move them into these locations? Keep in mind, if you move them into these locations, you might have some of the issues that we've already discussed. Solution, possibly like Cabrini Green in Chicago, you can move everybody of color into one particular housing project. African Americans are moving into the neighborhoods, and white homeowners are concerned about property value. Scenario 6, we're trying to figure out how much the person can leave to their children. They have the same amount of children, 2, but the home purchased in 1955, this individual was not, which means the black American's ability to transfer wealth to the next generation is not likely. For this section, you want to lobby the government for a solution to inherited wealth. Scenario 7, interest rates. Historically, women and African Americans are charged less interest rates, which could have an impact on housing. Here we have the cost of a home, $23,400, the down payment, the amount they're financing, and you have an interest rate of 7%, which means it is the same for everybody. However, if you look at historic interest rates, here we have 25. Now notice how African American interest rates are 25, 14, whereas here they're both the same. So when they're both the same, the monthly payment is $261. However, white Americans are paying $301 for a home in comparison to African Americans paying $450. You want to lobby the federal or state governments for banks charging higher interest rates based on race or economics. Scenario 8, redlining and realtors. We continue with this theme. So realtors could also play a role here in this scenario. You are going to love it here, whereas in this situation here where we have a African-American family, they're being told by the realtor that maybe they should look in another area. Lobby the government. What's the issue? Real estate agents are directing buyers based on race to certain neighborhoods. Conclusion questions. You want to make sure that you complete the term sheet. And if you want to verify your definitions, here they go.